Yeah. Yeah, I like what you said, like why is it popular? But I also see like the that's like the pitfall of these teachings. But the positive, I see like sometimes it can become a guide because every time when we meditate, specifically, let's say a thought comes, we get lost in the stories of that thought, and sometimes just seeing that this story is just my story and there's nothing else, it kinds of like, oh, stop. It helps in the meditation process, but also it has that pitfall of like, well, I don't have to do anything to realize. Just yeah, like everything is perfect, everything is good, everything else is illusion. Anyways, yeah. And I see that in Advaita circles a lot, and it becomes like also a justification for how things are in a way. So yeah, I see that, which and also I like what you said that like people are looking for shortcuts, and I think like that becomes a huge problem in the self-realization or the spiritual path, which I see. And the shortcut could be that, the tantra path, the new tantra, could be psychedelics, could be anything, which is just like, oh, I just want a pill to take me to enlightenment. Once I get enlightenment, all my problem is gone. I become this thing, and I am that being. I've achieved things in my life. So yeah, the pitfalls of our egos playing with those games for sure is there. So do you think is it safe to say like and also you mentioned that the tantra you will not absorb it if you're not ready, and it is very heart centered, it's very heart transmitted. So do you think is it safe to say that like on a path of self realization, the first initial steps would be meditation itself, like like creating a solid meditation practice, and when the tantra appears in our life, that's when it appears, not like going straight to tantra, because that's when we can get lost. Do you think it's safe to say that?
Let's see. Well, first, maybe I'd like to confirm to what you just said. Meditation, in a way, is an alpha and omega of spiritual practices. And if we think of a real kind of archetype of Eastern approach, what would that be? And that kind of peacefully sitting garden sculpture of Buddha that you can find in every nursery today really epitomizes the entire Orient. It's this is an archetype of the Oriental Eastern approach. It's that triangular kind of, triangle rests on its base, upward facing, as that figure in meditation is an iconic image which is relevant to all absolutely cultures, and it's the whole entire Eastern civilization, certainly Indian civilization. So meditation is not only a part, an optional, let alone optional part. This is where the real thing really happens. Because without meditation, it is nearly impossible to reach the conditions that are desired and required for certain neurophysiological processes to settle down so that one can clearly begin to witness certain stuff. Yes, maybe there is an alternative. Maybe there are some more rare approaches. Like, let's say, the very opposite to that would be movement, dance. And we know that in certain African tribes, very ancient tribes, that was the approach of how to go beyond this. But how practical that is and how many can do that. We're not talking about putting music and dancing for 20 minutes, half an hour. We're talking about here the dance as it performed as that kind of rhythmical movement, to the drum, where that vibratory power, that rhythm of vibration, eventually takes one to that more primordial vibration at the heart of all matter, where it can ignite and awaken that dormant power. When we know very well that it was even Lee Sanella, the founder for Kundalini Research Institute for Kundalini Research, he brought this example of the very little known African tribe where the very leitmotif of that culture was to awaken Kundalini, so that majority of people of that tribe should live in that awakened state. Whereas in the Orient, the approach was different. The approach was to subside all metabolic activity, and so that it can bring about this possibility for, and we can just begin to talk about, I'm not going to talk about because I'm not even talking about scientific studies, all the EEG scans and all this brain, heart activity and all the rest of it that has been done now since the 60s and the 70s of what the meditation does. Okay, so let's say we don't approach it from the point of view of applicational methodology for well-being of the body, but speak about it exclusively from the point of view of methodology for self-realization. So meditation is indispensable, because in meditation the possibility is met where certain states of absorption can take place, without which these psychic tendencies have no chance, A, to be brought to the surface, and B, as the tradition speaks of this, what happens in these states of absorption, to be rendered impotent, in other words, roasted. These karmic seeds are there, and it is only in the state of samadhi when these seeds can be roasted. Not eradicated, roasted. In other words, they're still there, but they don't sprout. Let's give it a go with an analogy borrowed from neurophysiology. All this is due to the synaptic connections that were formed. Some of these synaptic connections are very ancient and passed on to us. Others are acquired and learned. One way or the other, all these synaptic connections give us an idea of who we are. And this bioelectric process of pranic currents of this gut and brain circuit, which I call biological wheel of samsara, constantly in motion. Electric synaptic connections, each time the connection is made, brings about a qualitative, or rather sends the information down to the endocrine system, which then issues a certain hormones down into the body. These hormones gives us or prompts us to act and react and interact in a way that we used to, because now it becomes a biological affair. Once this action performed, the craving begins to form to send that impulse again, so that these synaptic connections are revived and issue again that electric response due to that connectivity, and another cascade of hormones goes down. So from the point of view of neuroscience, and I'm not at all a neuroscientist, don't have degree, just speaking like a layman, just to give it another example, right? So that why these methodologies are now being appropriated by some really cutting-edge neuroscientists themselves. It's now interesting time. The borderline between spiritual teacher, adept, spiritual perceptor, and a scientist began to be blurred. So we kind of already entered that time when alchemy was the mother of all sciences, when art, science, and spirituality were not divorced. So many of this, or some of this at least, neuroscientists offer transformative workshops where they utilize tantric methodologies. They just use another language, but the techniques, methods are as ancient as the sun. See? Because insight is given now, insight is gained to what is happening to this complete circuit which makes us prisoners to our conditionings. And meditation is what sets us free, or can potentially set us free. And of course, it is only when life force is released fully, it is only when Kundalini is fully awakened, the conditions are created, when a lot of these synaptic connections get unplugged. And what this is also known as process of rewiring. This process of rewiring is very uncomfortable because it is experienced as losing the borders of whom we considered ourselves to be. It can be as intense as depersonalization, or it can be simply experienced as losing the ground on which we stand, no longer knowing who we are, existential crisis, not longer knowing what's the purpose, why, what are we doing, and so forth. Because this rewiring unplugs and the degree of that unplugging manifests itself to the degree of how uneasy we feel, you see? So if you have qualitative teachings to lean on, then you are better off. Or one who has these teachings, one who has a proper philosophical, esoteric background or ground to stand on, then one can go through this process, I would say, less, with a less chance of being burnt out or derailed, because this is also, we should not hesitate to speak about this, because in the intensity of the process, without qualitative teachings, without the place, role, and purpose of the perceptor, there's a lot of derailment taking place. So in other words, today, it's hard to speak about Kundalini in its full measure, simply because we are not speaking about a wealth of Kundalini displaying its glory and power. Most of what we're witnessing is in fact psychotic episodes on the account of what is being experienced as a phenomenology of the process. That's not observing Kundalini at work. Kundalini may slightly move, there's agitation, and yet it sends tremors throughout the entire neurophysiology as pranic currents begin to vibrate, and that prior to that mostly dormant structure of the nadis, the subtle pathways of energy, experience this first surge of current, pranic current. What that is accompanied by is the release of tremendous information from psychic centers. And the process unfolds from there, not culminates there, unfolds. So what we mostly dealing with, as I just said, is the display of how and to what degree psychologically immature and polluted we are as a culture. because individual is not an island, is not here experiencing it independently from everything else. So awakening here then would need to be spoken in relation and in connection to the full gamut of what it means to be alive in our day and age. It's not a villager somewhere in South India or in the mountain region of Himalayas or Central Asia on a Tibetan plateau who wakes up with the wealth of that kind of archetypal information and everything. A modern man or woman wakes up with a lot of garbage in their system, with a lot of unprocessed information, I meant to say. So this is what makes this process into often a volatile one. If it's just a light, gradual activation, then perhaps there's no real need to worry. But fully blown awakening when the body is not ready can be accompanied by a lot of undesirable consequences. But that happens. We've talked about it earlier. We've witnessed that. We're witnessing this as we speak. People wake up. Sometimes nothing to do with the spiritual methodologies. They just wake up. The force wakes up. The power wakes up to itself with no regard for the preservation of the species, so to speak. With no regard to, how many, just read the YouTube comments beneath the videos and you can find, how some people just, I don't want this awakening, I don't want it. I want my life back. I hate this Kundalini. I hate all this. So that is also another thing, you see. So going back to that rewiring phase, in itself it's a very healthy phase, because without that rewiring, there is no possibility for creating more life-conducing, more, simply more wholesome connections which will contribute to greater and greater integration, which can then bring the possibility of living this life in that state, what the awakened Kundalini represents, where the disparity between what happened at the level of consciousness and physiology is not accompanied by that rupture, because physiology lags behind. In our day and age, that is a fact. So therefore, so much is required in terms of our participation and collaboration, lifestyle, change in diet, attitude, associations. It's not just spiritual practices, get off the mat and run to do our own thing that you used to. You see that when people do that. Or not everyone can lock themselves into the ashram either. So this is what we're addressing here.
So when the Tantra comes in here, so do you think after the Kundalini awakening, and also I also want you to touch, I know you have touched base on the Kashmiri Shaivism, but I also want you to touch base on the Tantra rooted in Kashmiri Shaivism. So I wanted to ask you after the Kundalini awakening, even starts, that's when the path of Tantra comes in, and how the Tantra of Kashmiri Shaivism is different. What are the methodologies and how a person takes this path?
Right. Yes, of course. No, we didn't have the chance to touch that when the Tantra comes in, because you did ask that earlier. We spoke about it earlier when I was saying that the situation in the past was not much different. So Tantra or Tantric teachings have always tailored to a more kind of popular level, to the household at large, as well as to those who qualify to receive the full, let's say, fully blown teaching, to receive the intricacies and so forth. So there's no such thing as when Tantra can come or when can one begin to practice Tantra. Because Tantra is it's an attitude and philosophy of life. It's a way of life. It's a way of living. It's an embracing this creation as the embodiment of your own awareness. And yes, you did say that very aptly so, that the distinction between Tantric perspective on this creation and, let's say, in comparison, the Advaitic one, radically different in its attitude towards this Maya. The Vedantic perspective sees Maya as simply an aspect which literally has that quality of appearance, whilst Brahman, as the absolute, is an inert and uninvolved. If we have the time to get back to that maybe later on, because it also will not give a full justice to just speak about Advaita Vedanta in these reductionistic terms. But let's say, in general speaking, yes, even the Tantric teachers and Kashmir Shaiva masters certainly very often juxtaposed the perspectives of Kashmir Shaivism with both Vedantic and prevalent at that time Buddhist traditions, with the emphasis on shunyata and the experience of the void, which also negates the experience of this, negates this sensory involvement with the world because it's transitory and not even happening. So the Tantric perspective on Maya is that it's nothing other than quality of Shakti. So therefore, Maya is spoken of as Maya Shakti. It's a quality of reflecting power of awareness to contemplate its own glory. Because Shakti is Shiva. And that dyadic relationship between Shiva and Shakti is exemplified in luminosity and the power of being able to reflect that luminosity to itself. It's that power that falls back on itself. And every experience, absolutely every experience, whatever experience we may speak about, has that quality to it, has that aspect to it. Because no experience is ever separate from that dyadic relationship of Shiva and Shakti. Each time there's a contact of the senses with an object of experience, that is what's taking place. This is the unique positioning perspective that Tantra offers to the world. So for that reason it is called positivistic, saying yes, it's all embracing. It's not negating the world. It also says it's oxymoron to denounce or renounce the world, because you cannot renounce that what is the quality of your own awareness, which is exemplified by the dynamic power of Shakti. So this dyadic relationship is this Prakasha and Vimarsha. The cornerstones of Tantric teaching begins with the understanding of these two qualities, these tattvas, these primordial qualities at the heart of all experience. Prakasha is that luminosity of awareness, and Vimarsha is that light of self-awareness that falls back onto itself. So this Prakasha and Vimarsha. Prakasha is the quality of Shiva, and Vimarsha is the quality of Shakti. Therefore, tradition calls it sometimes dealingly or indealingly Vimarshini, like dearest, Vimarshini, Shakti that is Shiva in disguise. So every experience, down to minute experience of sensory perception, is nothing other than recreation of that original act, always. Enough to read these great sages like Abhinavagupta, Somananda or Utpaladeva, Ksemaraj, all these great Kashmir Shaiva sages. And this analogy of the dancer coming on the stage, performing an act, and off she gone. Is this what the sensory perception that the body is equipped with through the organs of cognition is all about? It's for display and for the enjoyment. So therefore, Abhinavagupta says it's that Shakti dances at the tips of my senses. What duality are we talking about here? So this life-affirming, really creative at its core, at its heart, because there is also this very large aspect of creativity, impulses of creative intelligence. That's what these Shaktis are. Myriad of Shaktis that this world is, a vibratory field of awareness, the shimmering ocean of sound, forms and phenomena, where this whole experience is for the sake of that shimmering light of one's own awareness available through minute experiences. This is also maybe where the beauty of the tradition begins to reflect some other traditions born on Orient, like in Zen Buddhism. Everything can be experienced in the minute act, in that very minute macrocosmic event. It has encapsulates and it has the capacity always, not only at a given moment and not at another moment. Always there is this possibility to experience infinity in the grain of sand, in a blade of grass, speaking the tongue of a poet. So this is what really drew me and what is so beautiful in the teachings of Kashmir Shaivism. So therefore, I don't want to say for a moment that in Tantra of Kashmir Shaivism you need to be prepared to walk it, because everyone already walks it. That's the perspective. It's recognizing that this life-affirming philosophy, at least from the standpoint of view of some of us, reflects the most of what is already experienced on a daily basis. Our love for beauty, harmony, is there. The moments when subject-object in such a repose, when we fall into that gap, and in that gap the subject and object for a moment can have the chance to embrace each other and forget about the differences. So this is not a prerequisite. There's no prerequisite to walk the path of Tantra other than having already that tenderness or that acuity, that willingness, or simply recognizing that this embodiment, this world of forms and phenomena, though transient, is still precious. And precisely because it's so transient, makes it even more precious. Not so that we cling to the moment in hopes to prolong it, but so that we can extract the juice out of every experience. Then there's no clinginess, because that's the mystery of that teaching, the mystery of that profound way of seeing and recognizing this reality for what it is. When we have the capacity to live fully, there cannot be regret nor clinginess. Clinginess comes not just, as some spiritual traditions and teachings maintain, from that identity. It's only one aspect. It also comes from the fact that the fullness of experience is not there. When the fullness of the experience is there, there's no propensity to cling, because it's like giving birth to something. You see, as an artist who created something, is ready for a next act.
Wow. I've never heard someone say that the cleanness is because the fullness of the experience is not there. Wow, like.
Yes, it's because we skim the surface, and skimming the surface creates this constant craving. We get out of the table after a sumptuous meal and we feel full of cravings because we are not attuned, aligned enough to get the fullness of that experience. And when the fullness is there, when the capacity to extract the fullness is there, then in all circumstances we find that. Because that in itself, in the very nature of oneness, this is where I squarely agree with all these non-dual perspectives, that there's no difference between here and there. In fact, there is no here and there. You cannot move from here to there. All there is movement in consciousness which doesn't have preference or quality. It is experienced at a given moment in time, subject to this collapse into a point in time. But when our consciousness is enlivened to a degree and awake to that, then there is no movement. This movement collapses already there and then into that where the movement itself rises, which is pure silence. So that realization of the esoteric Shiva and Shakti's embrace is brought into full equilibrium. This is full, that is full. From fullness, fullness rises. By fullness it is sustained. Into fullness it returns. What remains is fullness. Right? The famous Upanishadic verse, Purnamada Purnamidam, Purnat Purnam Udachyate, Purnasya Purnamadaya, Purnat Purnam Ivavashishyate. So this really is the Tantric teaching. These early Upanishadic teachings revived for a modern age, whether this is modern age 1,000 years ago, or 1,500 years ago, or 100 years ago, or today, just like with all perennial traditions, this understanding of renewal constantly taking place. So this interest in Kashmir Shaivism and Tantra today is understandable, legitimate, and really potentially filled with possibilities which we cannot even dream of, because it offers tremendous insights along with solutions to the dilemmas we're all collectively facing now. One of them is it's myriad of them, because they all stem from the same thing. It comes from fragmentation. So the long answer to when are we ready for Tantra? We're always ready for Tantra, because that's what Tantra is. Tantra is weaving together, Tantra is tuning together this instrument of the body.
So using the energy, working with the energy itself, and we have this energy, as you said, at the tip of my senses.
Exactly.
But also extracting the fullness of the experience that leads to the self-realization, because that fullness leads to the fullness itself. This is what I'm
I didn't say I didn't say exactly that. I didn't say that that leads to self-realization. It's actually the other way around. It's the other way around. It's self-realization leads to the possibility and ability to extract fullness, because that's where fullness comes from. Fullness cannot come from experience itself. This is true to all teachings.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah. So
Because for me, like before, I used to think that the path of renunciation, and I think Krishna also mentions in Bhagavad Gita, the renunciation itself is not renunciating the world and living in cave, because that's also an attachment itself to that experience of living in a cave. Renunciation is a renunciation in every moment itself. And I thought like that before, it's like also like that is a part of Tantra as well, because you're kind of engaging with life, but also with from a place of like not trying to cling to a moment because it's gonna pass, and that maybe is leading towards the self-realization and then the fullness of the experience, as you mentioned, after that happens. Yeah, so but I really love what you said, that the clinging arises because there's no fullness of the experience, because I've never heard someone say that. You know, it's just it does, yeah, it changes the game altogether. It gives a new perspective to why this is happening. You know, instead of like, oh, I'm clinging. This is very beautiful.
Well, you hear this, the regret, lament of any sorts comes only from the place of, I wish I lived this differently. Or if I were to give the chance, I would, like, you know, when we revisit this perspective, just like speaking in a worldly tongue, that when someone looks back and, oh, I wish if I knew, and that comes only from a misunderstanding, of course, misperception, but also because something was not lived fully. I remember when what struck me is, I read somewhere many years ago, still as a young artist, that the last words by Leonardo da Vinci were, well lived, long life. You know, it's a kind of almost like Vedic, very sagely saying, you know, well lived life, very tantric. You know, there's no regret, there's no lament, because was fully present to whatever was rising, to whatever was faced. It's lived, and this is quality, by the way. You can find that. Another aspect of Tantra is why, for example, creative personalities, beings, attracted to these teachings since its arrival on the stage. Always, any culture, you see that artistic personalities always find a lot of what they feel affinity with when it comes to when they are being introduced into the basic tenets of this teaching, because it's already a lived experience in those beings. To be able to create, you need to be fully present, completely, utterly, and fully present. It's always an act of self-sacrifice, because you have to sacrifice something out of yourself for the creativity to unleash itself fully. I'm not talking about how creativity may be viewed today and spoken, because language is so diluted now. But in, you know, so therefore this this is again along the lines of, when are we ready to walk the tantric path? You know, some of us already walking that path, not even knowing that. But then, of course, you know, it all becomes more expedient, you know, because then something else, and unraveling across the universe, as the great female mystic said, Rabbi, I think it was Rabayat or Layla of Kashmir, I don't remember. Mirabai, I think Mirabai said that. Being unraveled across the universe. When that begins, that's, though maybe a very different affair, but really it unfolds from that same very place, from that same place, because this is what Kundalini exemplifies and represents. It's a vibratory power, true to the individual, true to the cosmos. And it is the different frequencies of vibration which form different planes of existence. But all these are domains of Kundalini. So therefore, there's no awakening of consciousness without Kundalini. And there's no self-realization without Kundalini dissolving,
But this is the thing, this is where I think, I'm just talking from my personal experience and doubts, because I have met people who didn't have a Kundalini awakening process. But they had an experience, like for example, this gentleman that I recently met, he mentioned that suddenly he was at a tree and suddenly everything dissolved, and the tears were just flowing through his eyes. And after that, he calls himself a Tantrika because he's following the path of Tantra, which is a heart. He's living from his heart. But he doesn't recognize the awakening of the Kundalini. So that's where I get a little bit like I have met people who haven't had that experience. So do you think it's still possible? Like what is that experience?
Well, that's exactly why I've mentioned this course, because I feel the time has come that this need to be redressed.
Right.
Because when we speak about Kundalini, there's Kundalini and how it is used as this term. Right. Not all pranic activity is qualified for being recognized as true Kundalini activity. Nor there is an agreement in terms of what constitutes this, what we speak about all along. And yet, if we delve deep into tradition, we will find plenty of clear evidence and understanding, both tradition which many modern neo-Advaitins claim as their own. You will see how that power has always been recognized by the likes of Ramana Maharshi, and I'm sure if you sit down and have a private conversation back in the days with Papaji, right, then he was also deeply awakened and soaked in Shakti, in fact.
Right.
But people take home what they can, and they make teachings out of that. Right. Same is with, it's the same story everywhere. Kundalini activity is a very subtle activity, extremely subtle, and there are different ways. Therefore, in this course, what I particularly find important is to bring about these distinctions and intricacies so as to separate wheat from the chaff, whilst at the same time to speak about the intricacies of what takes place in the subtle anatomy, as well as how that relates in terms of the clinical perspective of those who undergo it. Though I have spoken about it and at some point gained myself a nickname Igor K, back in the days they used to call me, not because of my family name Kufayev, but because of the Kundalini. And because I gave a lot of talks about this, and my very first interviews were all on this topic. But they are scattered, these videos, these talks, this mostly in response to direct questions. But here I want to put it and line it up in a very coherent structure, without, of course, violating the tradition in a sense of disclosing it all, just like, because the whole point is that it needs to be worked with and approached with great respect to how tradition itself speaks about it. So this, for example, someone that you have just brought with these experiences that they deny, it doesn't matter how people speak about what state they embody, what experiences they had. Proper understanding, Kundalini conducts absolutely every affair in the house. Every shift, every motor and pranic activity, any cognitive activity in the body in the physical, in the subtle, is all in the affairs directly and under direct orchestration of Kundalini as a force. Read Ramana Maharshi's letters. That's an eye-opener for those orthodox neo-Advaitins who dismiss that power. The teachers who teach in a broad daylight and call Kundalini a spiritual candy or just a child's play, they have no idea whatsoever, because we live in a time of circus as well. Forgive me for saying that. But it's not to dismiss, or be critical about the peers in the field. A lot of people doing a magnificent job out there. But at the same time, a lot of people speak from a place of not knowing and not having any experience whatsoever. Yet when there is an understanding what actually Kundalini represents, then one knows that there's no slightest movement, be it a movement at the level of the heart, any pranic movement. In fact, if the guy says that follows the path of the heart, prana rests at the heart. All pranic activity rests at the heart. Each time we go into a deep sleep state, every night when we temporarily experience as this body deep sleep, all the pranas gather in the heart. That is why there is no sensory activity and no mental activity. And that's where all the pranic currents are resting. This is why, in accord with yogic tradition, Tantric, yogic, spoken interchangeably here, all prana rests in the heart, and that's where the seat of Kali, the supreme power of Shakti, which guides all transformative process, because it's the electromagnetic power. It's the power of transformation. What at the base of the spine, spoken about as the dormant force, is another power altogether. It's the power of individuation. You see? The power where that spiritual force is in a state of homeostasis, in a state of contracted state of awareness, which still empowers everything in the house, but it is not active, let alone released. And of course, yogically speaking, there is this higher abode where the nectarian qualities or lunar qualities, unless awakened, unless rekindled, there is no possibility for that alchemical transformation where that ambrosia, so-called nectar of immortality, being issued into the body, which is the only reason why one can experience fullness and satisfaction, because that substance, even chemically speaking, what brings about state of beatitude, state of happiness, fullness, completeness, all these qualities of known as different kind of juices, right? Serotonin and the rest of it, the drug of happiness. Before that, if there is not enough serotonin, we are addicted, one way or the other, addicted to this or that, to this substance or that substance, to this activity or that activity. But going back to why some people deny that is because not all active Kundalini is experienced as a rising of the golden mold, molten gold. This is also, we'll need another interview or two just to go through the intricacy of this. So just to say that whatever anyone has experienced, and when they say, well, that's nothing to do with Kundalini, it's simply lack of education and lack of knowledge on their part. Not because they saying something wrong, it's simply because they don't understand what Kundalini is, or their understanding is partial, therefore they speak about something else and denying something else altogether. But just to say, I have met many people, and myself, I had many of these satoris waking up suddenly in the midst of all the calamities in my life and everything going through this and that. It's like wherever, 25, 30, 35, age doesn't matter. We can experience this pressure, existential pressure at any age when we are already emotionally equipped to feel something, right? And suddenly you have this opening, and the windows are open, and there's rain outside, and you feel complete equanimity, repose. You may have nowhere to live tomorrow when you wake up, but it does not matter at this moment. You feel one with the rain, one with the sky, one with everything. Of course, you cry, your heart opens up. You know how many of these experiences a real sadhaka goes through? What I like also about Zen, let me just maybe, is the healthy dose of get real kind of thing, slap you in the face to kind of wake, to get out of all this dreamy kind of stuff, is that precisely slap also is a part of the teaching in that tradition. It may be relaxed and abandoned when Zen masters came to the West to kind of not to offend the Western seekers, but very much part in Zen culture is to any kind of enamoring with these little realizations and what we make out of them. You see? So always healthy dose of, right, master, or like, last night I had this, right, and suddenly and all, and the master is like supposed to give you nod. Instead, he pours the tea himself, drinks it, and then relieves himself, like, passes the air and says, hey, can you pass me that broom? I think we need to just like cut down basically, it's very healthy. You know how a lot of spiritual seekers hold on to these experiences?
Right.
And they made them into something. They made them then, and of course, I'm not saying about you associate and someone no, of course not. It's I don't know the person, but I'm saying that it's a very common thing. Very common thing. So, but if somebody says that this is not Kundalini, then it's like, okay, well, one day you will find out what real Kundalini is, and then it will leave no doubts, you see.
Yeah, definitely.
And I've met people who were practicing spiritual teachers, meditation teachers, ordained monks, ordained nuns, and worked with them. Those who already were in a position of guiding others, and it happened to them, and they didn't know where to go because they did not have that within their given tradition. So, so whenever people say this is not this, that, kind of like you take it with a pinch of salt and you carry on your work.
Because from my personal experience, I had a Kundalini awakening on meditation itself, like on Vipassana. So, and since then, there was just I wanted to learn Tantra. I was not on a path of Tantra, I was not interested in Tantra. But after that, there was just like, what is Tantra? Like, I want to know, because I'm experiencing this, which is beyond my comprehension. And it was not an easy journey. Like, it's been 2 years, and it's been a very interesting journey. Moments where, oh, why this is happening, but moments of just acceptance. And then when I hear people who haven't had this, like, so what I'm going through, what is this? This question comes up for sure. And I agree with your point that I think without Kundalini, the total transformation cannot happen. Because I feel like even since the experience of Kundalini awakening, there is something that is happening that is beyond my comprehension, the transformation that is happening, which is part of it. Yeah, so which is very interesting.
And that's precisely why tradition itself, the Tantra itself, it speaks about futility of defining Kundalini, because Kundalini is consciousness, chitti, and consciousness can never be turned into an object. So therefore, with all that, what is spoken through metaphor and elaborate, often semi-poetic way, there is still this healthy understanding that one cannot define that which illumines experience itself. That's what Kundalini is. The Kundalini and soul can be spoken interchangeably. And so the whole understanding of Kundalini happens not through being able to know what Kundalini is, but rather than awakening of that life force gives that perspective of whom you consider yourself to be, and through that different prism of whom you considered yourself to be, you begin to realize what is this notion of human being. And that's what Kundalini does. So it's not that we know what Kundalini is, because it's consciousness which, again, rhythms and vibrations, cooled off vibrations experienced as matter. When they become more and more and more and more refined, there is a possibility where that what we considered ourselves to be, along with all the solidly held notions and ideas, begin to dissolve, merge in that frequency. And as they begin to dissolve and merge, that self-knowledge arises on its own accord. So this is, that much I would feel compelled to say.
Right. Thank you, Igor. I can continue this conversation. I don't want to stop, but we have already gone 2 hours plus.
Yeah.
But before we end, I think I would ask a couple of questions about your course, which is it going to be an online course, and just anybody can join, like someone who has any experience in Kundalini and just curious about it, and it'll be 3 months. Do you want to give some more information about that?
Well, yes, the course is tentatively planned as 3 months and contains of 9 modules. For approximately maybe we will space them 3 modules per month, and some of the modules will be with discourses, and there will be at least 3 dedicated to interactive questions and answers. The opening will be live, and then it will be then pre-recorded so as for convenience of the course participants to work with this material on their own. And it is open to all levels and to all people of work, all walks of life, because this is precisely the nature of the course, because it's A, educational, and B, very practical in terms of what the course will also offer, because it will also include that Kundalini care part. What else is there to add? It will contain quite a bit of perspective in terms of how do we know about this term, where it comes from, of course. It will be historical perspective, right? Classical and clinical views and comparative analogies in various schools and traditions. But then it will proceed to the very stages of the process, which is very important, I think, to give that fuller picture, culminating with the aforementioned Kundalini care, how best to tend. So in other words, it's open for those who already have some brush or are going amidst of that experience or trying to integrate, because one way or another, I've been somehow finding myself working with a lot of people who already have experiences in that. There are those who have come and had this process initiated in them already over the time as students. But a lot of people also came from years of spiritual work and from variety of different backgrounds. So it gives me this wider spectrum, a wider range in terms of the comparative analysis of how that process can display itself. And you'd be surprised how a lot of common factors involved, especially when it comes to less desirable, awakenings and deviations and kind of complications and so forth. So in other words, it's a course that is aimed at bridging this quite a persistent dilemma, so that there is a greater clarity in terms of what that power really represents, so as to take it outside of exclusively tantric or yogic vocabulary and tradition, and give us this universal understanding on all transformative or so-called mystical experiences, and how that relates to our own spiritual journey. So that's what really the course is about.
I think a lot of people need this time, because throughout my experience, I've met so many people who are having a Kundalini experience, and it's very difficult even for them to integrate. And some people, there are a lot of misconception as well, which is there about Kundalini, and people just like, oh, I just want to raise my Kundalini because it will solve all my problems.
Yeah.
So it's very nice that you have created and formatted this course, which is very much needed in this time, for sure. Yeah. And also, it starts on 14th of May, if I'm right?
Yes, the tentative date for the first module, which is going to be live, is the 14th of May.
All right. Thank you, Igor. It was a wonderful, conversation. I really enjoyed it. I can continue this forever, but I cannot right now because we have time limits. But yeah, I would like to take these conversation maybe in the next steps going forward. And thank you for sharing your journey. Thank you for sharing your wisdom on Tantra and Kashmiri Shaivism, Kundalini, and also letting us know about the course that you have created. So thank you so much.
Sure. No, thank you. The pleasure is all mine, as they say. I really enjoyed talking about this, and we can continue some other time. So when you have maybe a particular angle, we can reconnect. Okay. Thank you.
Refine this now.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you, Mona.